There's a traditional Italian dance called the saltarello, from the Italian word saltare, to leap. And I can't help but feel that Beethoven had this dance or a similar folk dance in mind when he wrote this sunny, jolly music. And here's what just happened. That burst of energy that ignited this festive dance is this. I play slow. It's in unison and octaves, but there are those two tiny grace notes, the shortest notes you can play, that give the first two measures a special kick. And the melody is nothing but a straight F major triad, the key of this scherzo. So, we have this explosive F major triad, and then a light, bouncy, descending melody. And that's the easy part. Beethoven now extends this melody down one more measure, like so, and he adds this. He's created now a new two-measure cell. A little cell which will become very important later on. And he now uses it and extends it to a six-measure phrase. 1, 2, 3, 4. What? Which may sound kind of bizarre, but it works beautifully with these harmonies. What? Whoa! And voila, we're in A major, the symphony's main key, with this buoyant accompaniment in the strings. And ending in a grand A major triad that plummets downward, which is the reverse of the opening ascending F major triad. So here is this passage, the little two-bar cell and that bizarre modulation. And that's the first section of the scherzo. For the second section, Beethoven uses the opening grace note figure, now in A major, where we've just arrived. He starts it in the cello and bass, violas, second violins, first violins, from top to bottom. Very difficult for an orchestra to coordinate that passage. But wait 1 minute. What has Beethoven done here in terms of the harmony thus far? Because whether it's a minuet or a scherzo, the opening section always starts in the tonic key, and then it moves to the dominant key. So in the scherzo of the Eroica Symphony, for instance, Beethoven is in E flat major, the tonic key, and it moves very quickly to the dominant key, B flat. But here in the seventh, Beethoven starts in F major, but he quickly shifts into A major, totally ignoring the traditional format. If he starts in F major, he should move to the dominant key, which is C major. But he doesn't. He magically moves from F major up a third into A major through that strange modulation. And the effect is startling. Come to think of it, Beethoven was all over the place in the scherzo of the Sixth Symphony. He started in F major, you remember, but he slipped down a third into D major. You just cannot keep up with this man. There's so much coming at you, sometimes you can only see it in the rearview mirror. Anyway, here in the Seventh Symphony, we've just arrived in A major for the second section, which begins with the... And Beethoven will now use his little two-measure cell, this one, in a most unusual way. First, he harmonizes it in the woodwinds. Then he isolates the second measure. Just that. And he begins to repeat it several times per phrase. moving from A major to D major to a dark G7 chord. Then he goes through C major, and then F, and then B flat. Listen to it happen. And we build into a big restatement of the main scherzo in F major. But let's look at this very curious passage. What's this? Or this? Or this? And the last time I was leading this work on the podium, I was immersed in the sound of it. And it occurred to me that it's just that. It's sound. There's very little musical sense to it. But as pure sound and its properties that are reflected in the air, like the first movement, sound that echoes and fades, that makes total sense. Here it is again. So there's much more than your standard concert listening going on here.
Wow, this is so cool. I just love this. What a contrast, hey? What a contrast from the second movement going into the third movement with this incredible burst of energy. Right after that sort of long chord of the second movement ending, and suddenly this burst of energy going up, sort of mimicking the Mannheim sort of gestures, right, which is known as sort of like big scales up and down, just something that's full of energy for an orchestra to embrace. And this is just incredible that he's not only combining a march, a dance of sorts, but also with such energy. And to add on to that, what Larry is talking about, which I find fascinating, is his way of using harmony too, to burst out of the seam. So there's so much energy ripped inside that it just goes all over the place, like an explosion, right? And the way that our producers have put in these sort of cosmic rays and cosmic, images, evokes in me the sort of idea that it's very universal, very kind of part of this cosmic world that we live in, where solar flares and other energy is just bursting in the seams, and we're not really always sure of what it will look like. And I think Beethoven is really aware of this. He's so aware, and I love that. Larry just said, you can't keep up with this man. You just don't know what he's going to do next, And so what he's done here with the harmony, and what he's done here with sort of the bursting our expectations of what's happening, it knows no limits, right? Because the audience understands that after the second movement, there'll be a third movement where there will be some sort of march scherzo, minuet scherzo, trio section. We know kind of what to expect, but what he does there, we don't expect at all, right? And he's revolutionary in this way also, but it just spurs so much of the imagination and the creativity of the musicians, and which is, I think, why musicians throughout the ages have really just loved performing Beethoven. There's something unexpected, something brilliant, something that you can always extract. And I want to turn your attention to what he mentions at the end, which I think is just fascinating, because he does these little figures, sort of the diminished chord and the resolve, right? But they're sort of not related. They're all sort of what he calls it's just sound that makes very little sense, but it's sound that echoes and fades. And I really, really feel like he's started this in some of the Beethoven sonatas, and you can really hear that when he's experimenting with trills, experimenting with different gestures that bounce and goes all over the place. And then he transposes that onto and transcribes that into the orchestra realm. And I think it adds even more color than obviously the piano. I mean, I love the piano as a pianist, but the orchestra is just no comparison to the amount of colors and warmth and the way everything moves, right? And so what a genius. What an absolute genius.
Now, as the scherzo continues, Beethoven takes his three main elements: the opening motive, that jolly descending dance, and the extension. And he adds a fourth, which is the final cadence, with its triads. And he mixes all of them up into a fantastic fleet-footed dance, including a full soaring version of the main theme. And so, ending the main scherzo with a hammered version of the opening, which is very similar to what he did in the scherzo of the Sixth Symphony. We find ourselves now temporarily suspended on a long A, the pitch A, and it's held just long enough for Beethoven to clear the air harmonically as the A, being the third note of F major, now becomes the fifth note, or the dominant of D major, for the central trio section. But that tempo has no connection whatsoever to the main scherzo. They are vastly different as it is, a lively saltarello and a gentle processional. But at Beethoven's authentic flowing tempo, or something close to it, the main scherzo and this trio now exist in the same musical realm as counterparts of one another. In the trio's second section, the woodwinds continue this lovely, graceful song, all voiced in thirds. And the violins continue their mystical sheen of this sustained A. But now Beethoven adds the second French horn, 3 octaves below, playing the same drone figure. So we have, it's both rustic and solemn at the same time. Sounds like Pilgrims to me. And as Beethoven builds now to a full statement of the trio theme, the music intensifies with both diminished seventh chords in the winds and the hemiola rhythm, which is set in motion by the low horn and its drone. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 2. And there, a majestic peroration of the Pilgrim's theme in all its glory. The sustained A is now in the trumpets and timpani, subtly connecting us, I would say, with the main scherzo. And ending now with a descending triad in the trumpet and horn. Another connection with the main scherzo. And this second half of the trio repeats, and the folk song element is so obvious in the continued use of thirds in this lovely arching melody. And the low horn continues its drone. And in the transition back to the main scherzo, the religious association with this hymn becomes more obvious with a simple chorale in the strings, as the countrified low horn continues its drone. And you'll hear this A seventh chord magically change to a C seventh chord, leading us directly back.
The way in which Larry talks about Beethoven is in such a way that is analytical, right? It takes a lot of what he's doing and tries to put all the pieces together. And I really, honestly, on a side note, feel like all composers really should study Beethoven and try to rewrite his music, or to, just transcribe it on paper and understand the building blocks of how it all happened. Because in terms of structure, in terms of what is necessary on the page in order for music to flow, it's perfect. It's exactly what you need. Nothing too much, nothing too little. And yet there's all these surprises and twists and turns, sort of like, and like the way he takes you harmonically to all different places through these sort of transitional harmonies. It's like being on a roller coaster. It's so fascinating. It's so cool. It's so much fun. And then you're suddenly suspended in this long held A, which I really think is something that is brilliant in its own way, because it clears the slate and then you don't know what's going to happen next. And I think Schubert does this as well, really brilliantly, and many composers also use this in a way to just sort of move ever so slightly into a different dimension. And whether you're suddenly you're floating in space and you suddenly want to drop down to something much lower, you're just suspended in the air. And I think that not only is it a suspension in time, but it's also a suspension within the realm of the physical place that you're at before you decide to head into a different direction. And I think it's just brilliant how Beethoven does this. And I really think that, as someone who, I aspire to be a composer as well. And I think that studying what Beethoven does is something that I think you would always benefit from. It's sort of, what do they say about pianists? The Bach Prelude and Fugue, the World Tempo Clavier, sort of the Old Testament, and then the Beethoven piano sonatas are like the New Testament. And I think it's something very archaic, but also a building block, a foundational understanding of how music works, and all the extraneous stuff is gone. It's just what is necessary, and it's just brilliant. So understanding this with Larry's commentary has been just a dream, I think. And now with this episode, this part, we've talked a lot more about the pastoral trio section, where it's a gentle lilting tune. And one thing I want to highlight before we move on to the next part, which is also very exciting, is how he talks about metronome markings. Now, very briefly, because I think Larry isn't trying to get into all the controversy of whether Beethoven's metronome markings are accurate or not, whether he had working metronomes. Back then, that technology was still in its sort of genesis. So whether these metronome markings are accurate or useful, I think accurate could be sometimes questioned, but useful is definitely something that is really important. And to his point, there are some modern conductors who have taken his metronome markings to the dot, to the T, and actually obeyed them. And the music that comes out of it is breathtaking. It's a lot faster than what we were used to, but how are we supposed to know how Beethoven wanted his music to sound like if we don't even try his metronome markings, And I think there's just so much brilliance in the way he plans his music. Part of an interpreter's job is to see how time works within these pieces. And if we take something a lot slower than the composer intended, or a lot faster than the composer intended, it sometimes and often doesn't work in terms of its connection from one part or one section to the other. And so I think I totally completely agree with Larry here that, if the trio is too slow, it's too drastic a change from the opening section. And sometimes just what's brilliant is just to do what Beethoven wrote. Just do what he said. And if you have 84 as the trio section, then the main scherzo just needs to be a bit faster, and then therefore you already have your two tempi set. This is a little bit more of a music lovers and musicians and interpreters sort of rant over here, but I hope you enjoy that. I think what makes music happen is to follow exactly what the composer intended, especially if a composer you're working on is someone as brilliant and as picky as Beethoven. My teacher would often say that there are certain composers that you just follow every single marking to the bone and tip, and those ones are Beethoven, Ravel, and Bartók. Everything that you need to know is written in the music directly, and just don't mess with it. If you do that, the music will work. So with that, I think it gives us a lot to think about before we're moving on to our next part, which will take us back into the scherzo section of the third movement.
And the scherzo returns. And again, we have Beethoven's new 5-part scherzo design here. Scherzo, followed by trio, then scherzo in the middle, trio again, and final scherzo. But in this middle scherzo repeat, a literal repeat, note for note, of the main scherzo, Beethoven makes a single change. He indicates that everything be played very softly, delicately, like a pre-Mendelssohn scherzo. A delightful, magical effect. Then we hear the full trio again, and then the final repeat of the main scherzo with full dynamic range. And at the very end, a mini coda. And it sounds as if we're headed for a third playing of the trio. The long A and the trio in D major, now D minor. And D minor here allowed Beethoven to slip back into F major, our main key, quickly and decisively for a surprise ending. Before we move on, I want to say 2 things about this scherzo. The first, an instrumental note. The timpani, the kettle drums, used in the orchestra of the day, and limited to 2 drums, each of which could only play 1 note at a time. The drums had calfskin heads and hand screws around the rim that could be tightened or loosened to produce high or low pitches. But this takes time to do. So composers had to limit the timpani part to just 2 notes or pitches for each movement of a symphony, and the player could retune the drums to other pitches if needed in the pause between the movements. And the common default setting for the timpani was always the tonic and dominant notes of the main key. So if you're in D major, the smaller, higher timpani would be tuned to D, the tonic, and the lower drum would be tuned to A, the dominant. And this allows the timpani to play in the greatest number of passages in the movement, especially the big ones that need that special tympanic oomph. This. Yes, how many times have we heard that from the timpani? So in Beethoven's 7th Symphony, it's basically in A major, second movement in A minor. The timpani are tuned to A, the tonic, and E, the dominant, for the first, second, and fourth movements. But the third movement, scherzo, is in F major, an unusual choice, but the tuning plan would still seem obvious. The high drum would be tuned to F, the tonic, and the lower drum should then be tuned to C, the dominant. But Beethoven thought otherwise. He keeps the A from the other movements for the low drum, which results in some pretty novel writing for the timpani in this scherzo. Much of the movement is in F. The high drum F is used to accentuate rhythm and texture. And this dovetails now with my second observation about the scherzo. Beethoven's groundbreaking harmonic design for the scherzo essentially makes A major, not C major, the de facto dominant key. So that crazy first passage, the tonic key, but instead of moving to C major, the dominant, for the first cadence, which we would expect, and any other composer, including Beethoven, would have done that, he stuns us by moving into A major, keeping us connected in a way to the symphony's main key. But this amazing progression is all the more powerful because the high drum punches up the rhythm of the opening, F major, while Beethoven holds back the lower drum until the music shifts into A major, and then he releases it. And And when we get to the trio in D major and that majestic full version of Beethoven now has the low drum A ready to beef up the trumpets on the dominant note. And I'm reminded of the first movement of Beethoven's Fifth in C minor, of course, where he established the key of F minor, you may recall, as sort of a surrogate dominant key. Here in the scherzo of the Seventh, the tonic F major continually gravitates to A major through that bizarre modulation as its polar key, A major, while the standard dominant key, which would be C major, is used only in passing, which really does, on some level, alter our perception of how these traditional harmonies affect us as we listen. We expect one thing, but we get something totally different. All of this plus a heck of a good time. A scherzo with the unusual combination of a zippy saltarello and a gentle pilgrim's hymn, another landmark in Beethoven's music. You can barely keep up with the guy. But the real thrill ride of this symphony is yet to come.
Wow, what a storyteller Larry is. I think it's, as I mentioned before, it's such a wonderful companion to Beethoven, who's also a fantastic storyteller. I can only really imagine that Beethoven, as a storyteller, if he ever told stories, would be such an engaging and brash sort of storyteller, suddenly surprising you something and then going to talk about something different and then suddenly surprising you again with another twist and turn. And what I love about this, is this movement, and what Larry talks about is the genius of it. The genius not only in the construction of the piece, but also the orchestration, which for many may not make much of a difference. Your enjoyment of the symphonies is not usually going to be too much altered by what you know about the instrument. Whether the clarinet is a B flat or an E flat, or whether the timpani is attuned to whatever key, it doesn't really make much of a difference. But when you understand this in the way that Larry talks about it, it makes a huge difference. It makes you understand that he's doing something a little bit revolutionary in a small little way. So I always think that change comes incrementally, and before you know it, something will happen, and you're like, oh wait, we're already here? How did we get here? So let's just talk a little bit about this and we'll wrap up because, man, I want to get to the finale. If this is just a foreshadowing of the, epic finale that we're going to get later on, I can only just imagine what's going to happen. And the funny thing is, I already have heard this symphony many times, and yet it always is so engaging to get this. Now, let's talk a little bit about how this movement ends, this coda, and also a little bit more about just the way that harmony works. And one thing is really, really interesting about Beethoven's writing is, as an interpreter, our teachers would sort of always talk to us and say, what would a lesser genius write? So you go to these, sections, a lesser genius might just stay in F major, and it would sound fine. Nothing's wrong. And yet Beethoven doesn't do that. Beethoven goes somehow from F to this triumphant A major, right? Which then leads and makes this trio in D major so triumphant and so fantastic, And so as an ending, what would a lesser genius write, right? He will just probably end it with this, okay, I've already come up with this great scherzo and trick. I don't need to do anything. Let's just end it with this triumphant note. And no, he doesn't. And this is something that's really interesting about Beethoven's writing. He tries to throw in something that you expect, and then suddenly mixes it in with something that you don't expect. So he does the usual sort of climb. He does sort of this wonderful D major section of this lulling, gentle, swaying tune, and then suddenly hits you with a D minor. And you're like, wait, what happened? It's as if the sun is suddenly covered up by the clouds, and you're like, well, where are we going? What's going to happen? And and you expect in a way too, because later on in different works of what we expect as a modern listener is that you expect, oh, this coda is going to be a long one. This coda is going to take us to something really interesting. And yet he doesn't. he's like, aha, I got you there. And then he ends with this triumphant sort of progression that's unexpected. It twists and gnarls you in a way. And he bursts into an ending and says, we're done. And I think what's really special about that is that it's so Beethoven, right? What he infuses in the music is not just something that is unexpected and revolutionary, but it's so characteristic of him as a composer, of him as a musician, of him as maybe even a person. And so, what I really love about music is that the composer's background is usually very quite important. Who he is as a person, his personality, who he was, how his interactions were with other human beings, his relationships, his human and romantic relationships. That sometimes is quite important. But I actually think that you can understand so much about a composer by just listening and understanding their music, and it shows you their personality. It shows you who they really kind of are as a person, because a lot of the time, our human relationships, and this could be a question for you as an audience member. The human relationships and who you are as a person, is that truly relevant to the art that you produce? Is it? Sometimes it is. But sometimes you can really dissect it and say, no, it has got nothing to do with it. And a very famous example of this is that during this legal custody battle between him and his a relative for the custody of his nephew, Beethoven was going through crazy. Like, he was sick, he was unwell, his stomach issues for most of his life, actually. And yet, at this time, he also wrote the Hammerklavier piano sonata, which is this incredibly intricate, complex, yet also broad piece. And you would say wouldn't put those two, the life event and the sonata together. You wouldn't. And so I think that there's an argument to be made about the separation of, their composer's life and their like relationships and what they did and what blah 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 with the music that is their art. And with that, I'll leave you with that. Let me know if you have any thoughts about this. It's been such a joy to have you join us. I want to give a big thanks to our team, our sponsors, our supporters. This is our team. These are people who make these shows happen. And I'm extremely grateful because these people also construct the kind of documentary you saw just now. The framing, the editing, the storytelling. Oh, a huge thanks. So I want to give thanks to also our supporters and organizers. These are people who are part of our season. We don't just do these shows once in a while. We're building always with different organizations, musical and otherwise. We're always trying to find different orchestras and conductors from really literally around the world. We have orchestras from Ecuador to Ukraine to all the way in the US, and we work with organizations in Europe and in Asia. And I myself, I'm an Australian. So, we're just all over the world. We're a very international group of people who are trying to make a difference and understand the world and streamed everywhere to where you are at. And I think the internet is such a wonderful global sensation. I think Beethoven would be fascinated with the internet. I actually think he would compose a lot less if he had the internet. It's a good thing he didn't, because he'd be too distracted, I think. But anyway, that's aside. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being a part of this show. If you'd like to join us and be a part of this, please write to us at our soundreceiver.com, virtualconcerthalls.com, and I look forward to see you next time in part 10 and 11 on other parts of this incredible journey, which is Beethoven 7, Magnificent 9 Symphonies, written and narrated by Larry Rapchak and produced by New Media Productions, Virtual Concert Halls, and the Architects of Music. Until next time, happy music making. See you soon.